On a frozen winter night in Duluth, 65-year-old retired Marine Robert Miller witnesses a moment that will forever change his life. Through blinding snow, a young woman kneels screaming beside her German Shepherd, crushed by a hit-and-run driver who vanishes into the dark. Blood stains the white street. No sirens. No help. Only one old soldier steps forward from the shadows. He doesn't yet know that this rescue is not just about saving a life, but about awakening a miracle. What happens next will break your heart and quietly heal it. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Winter ruled Duluth with quiet cruelty as heavy snow drifted across frozen streets and the steel-gray lake breathed mist into the pale evening sky. Cold pressed into bones, into memory, into everything that still moved. Robert Miller walked slowly along the icy sidewalk with the steady rhythm of a man who had marched through worse storms than this one. At 65, his body was still broad-shouldered and powerful beneath his thick marine coat, though time had carved deep lines into his weathered face and turned his once dark beard into streaks of iron gray. His hands were large, rough, and permanently scarred from years of rifle recoil, frozen drills, and the long labor of survival after the war. People who met him often mistook his silence for coldness, but those who watched closely saw something else beneath his disciplined stillness, a weight of memory that never slept. He lived alone at the edge of the city in a small wooden house with a sagging porch and a stove that never quite warmed the corners of the room. War had taken his son, his marriage, and his youth, and in return, it had given him only endurance. Beside him walked Buddy, an 8-year-old German Shepherd with dark sable fur dusted lightly with gray along the muzzle. Buddy was large, calm, and deeply attentive, moving with the thoughtful pace of a dog that had learned patience from an aging master. His eyes held quiet intelligence and an unshakable loyalty that no winter could freeze. Across the street, Emily Parker hurried toward her apartment with numb fingers wrapped around a fraying leash. She was 27, slender and pale, with long chestnut hair hidden beneath a knitted wool hat pulled low over worried brown eyes. Her movements carried the restless energy of someone who never quite felt safe standing still. Emily worked 2 jobs to pay rent and bought her art supplies from what little remained. Painting was the only thing that made her feel real, the only place where the loneliness softened. The dog trotting beside her was not just a companion but her entire family. Luna was a young German Shepherd with glossy black and tan fur, barely 2 years old, all enthusiasm and youthful trust. Luna walked with bouncing confidence, ears high, tail wagging even in the bitter cold, unaware of how fragile that happiness truly was. The sound came first, as a vibration through the frozen ground, then as the rising scream of an engine tearing through the quiet. Headlights burst through the snowfall, moving far too fast for the ice-glazed intersection ahead. Robert stopped mid-step, his instincts flaring before his mind could catch up. Emily turned in surprise, her breath catching as she saw the blur of metal sliding toward her. The sports car lost control at the corner, its tires skidding wide on black ice. Emily yanked on Luna's leash, shouting her name with raw panic, but the distance was too short and the speed too great. The impact was not loud, but it was final, a horrifying, dull crack that echoed down the empty street like a shot into the night. Luna's body was thrown sideways across the ice and came to rest against a snow-buried curb. The car swerved, corrected, and slowed just long enough for the driver to glance back. Jason Whitmore lowered the window an inch. He was 23, clean-cut, carefully groomed, with expensive blonde hair styled into effortless perfection and a face shaped by privilege rather than hardship. Fear flickered briefly in his eyes, not for the dog, not for the young woman screaming in the street, but for himself. The fear passed just as quickly. His mouth twisted into something that was almost a smile, thin and empty. Then the engine roared again, and the car vanished into the snow toward the lake road. No brake lights, no apology. Only exhaust and silence. Emily collapsed to her knees beside Luna. Her cries were sharp and broken, tearing from her chest in helpless gasps as she gathered the shaking body into her arms. Warm blood spread across the white snow in terrible contrast. She begged without words, whispered without sound, rocking back and forth as if motion alone could undo what had happened. The street was empty. No doors opened. No crowd gathered. Winter swallowed the sound and offered nothing back. Robert was already moving. His boots hit the ice with controlled urgency as he crossed the street. He dropped to one knee beside the girl without hesitation. His eyes took in the wound in one instant. Deep trauma to the hind leg. Heavy bleeding, shock setting in fast. He removed his scarf with steady hands despite the cold, biting into his own skin, and pressed it high against the injury with firm pressure. Emily looked at him in terror, her face streaked with tears and snowmelt, her breath shaking so hard she could barely speak. Robert met her gaze with calm authority, the kind that had carried men through firefights and home through nightmares. He spoke quietly, slowly, each word placed with care. He told her to breathe. He told her to keep talking to the dog. He told her the truth without cruelty. The next few minutes would decide everything. Buddy stood close, tense but silent, his body shielding without aggression, eyes fixed on Luna with unfamiliar distress. Robert lifted the injured dog with all the strength his aging body still possessed, careful to support the twisted leg as Emily clutched himself to his coat in desperation. The girl did not question where they were going. She only followed. The veterinary clinic lights were harsh against the snow-darkened windows when Robert carried Luna through the door. The nurse on duty was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and practiced gentleness. The veterinarian who emerged moments later was lean, serious, and focused, her voice efficient but human as she began assessing the damage. Emily stood trembling in the corner, her hands pressed to her mouth as if holding herself together by physical force. Robert remained nearby like a silent pillar, his coat soaked with melted snow and blood. They worked quickly. X-rays confirmed the worst. Severe fracture, internal trauma possible. Surgery was the only chance. The numbers came softly, but landed like gunfire. The estimated cost climbed beyond anything Emily had ever possessed. She shook her head in disbelief, whispering apologies she did not understand. Her world was folding inward around her, and she could feel it. Robert watched silently. His mind drifted not to money, but to the desert heat of a battlefield decades earlier, to a young Marine bleeding under his hands while a medic shouted that supplies were short. He had learned long ago that decisions either crushed a man or defined him. There was rarely space between. Robert stepped forward and asked for the forms. The nurse hesitated only a second before sliding them across the counter. He signed with deliberate patience. Not once did he look at Emily. Not because he was ashamed, but because he knew gratitude could become another burden the girl did not need. The surgery began immediately. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The street was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. Robert stood beneath a flickering street lamp, pulling his gloves back onto fingers that had begun to numb. For a moment, the weight of his choice settled fully into his chest. The savings he had guarded like a final lifeline were now gone. But the hollowness that once lived behind that money felt lighter than it had in years. When he returned briefly to the clinic entrance, he placed a small folded note at the desk. The nurse glanced at it in confusion before setting it aside. Emily never saw him leave. She only knew later that somewhere between despair and hope, a stranger had stepped into her life and vanished as quietly as the falling snow. And Robert, walking back into the frozen streets with Buddy beside him, knew with absolute certainty that the war he thought he had left behind had found him again in a different form, a quieter form, but no less real. The snow was still falling when Robert Miller reached his small wooden house on the outskirts of Duluth. The porch light flickered weakly against the frozen wind as Buddy followed him up the steps, shaking ice from his fur before settling near the door with a soft, anxious whine. Inside, the house smelled faintly of old wood, coffee, and the steel chill that never fully left the walls in winter. Robert removed his coat slowly and hung it on the same crooked nail he had used for years, then sat at the narrow kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a cup he had not yet filled. His mind had not followed him home. It remained at the clinic, trapped in the sound of Emily Parker's sobs and the shallow, broken breathing of the injured dog beneath sterile lights. He had signed the papers without hesitation, yet now the silence of his own home pressed heavily against his chest. He thought of the envelope hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom, the last of his savings, gathered from years of overnight shifts as a security guard and modest government checks that barely kept the furnace running. He had known the moment he lifted his pen that the choice was irreversible. What surprised him most was not the loss, but the quiet relief that followed it. Across the city, beneath fluorescent clinic lights that buzzed in the air like tired insects, Emily sat alone in a plastic chair with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had not yet learned the stranger's name. She only knew that his eyes had been steady when hers had collapsed into fear. The veterinarian who approached her was Dr. Margaret Klein, a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked brown hair pulled into a loose bun and a face shaped by long nights of difficult decisions. Her build was slight, but her posture carried authority earned through years of standing between life and loss. Dr. Klein spoke in gentle precision, explaining the surgery, the risks, and the uncertain hours ahead. Emily nodded without fully hearing, her thoughts circling the same question that beat against her skull with painful rhythm. How could she pay for this? She had $700 in her bank account, a rent payment due in 5 days, and no family within 1,000 miles who could come running. The world had always asked her to survive quietly, and now it demanded the impossible. When the nurse returned with the forms already signed, Emily's confusion surfaced through her grief. She asked quietly who had paid. The nurse pointed toward the door with a soft, puzzled expression and said only that the man had left. It wasn't until Emily returned to the counter hours later that she noticed the folded note resting beside the receipt. The words were few and written in a careful, tired hand. From one who has lost much. The meaning struck her harder than any long speech. A stranger had stepped into her life at its bleakest point and vanished without taking a name with him. Emily pressed the paper to her chest as the first fragile tremor of hope crossed her fear. Surgery lasted well into the night. The rhythm of machines filled the halls with steady artificial breath. When Dr. Klein finally emerged, her shoulders sagged with exhaustion, but her eyes held cautious relief. The bone had been stabilized. Internal bleeding had been controlled. The next 48 hours would decide the outcome, but the dog had survived the worst of the storm. Emily broke down silently, her body folding forward as the threat of total loss receded into trembling gratitude. Morning arrived gray and bitter. Robert had not slept. At dawn, he pulled on his coat and drove through narrow streets toward the clinic, breathing fog into the steering wheel as ice cracked beneath the tires. Buddy rode in the back seat, alert and restless. Robert did not go inside immediately. He remained in the truck across the street, watching the entrance as if guarding something unseen. He told himself he only wanted to be certain the dog had survived the night. Nothing more. After nearly an hour, he saw Emily exit the building briefly with red-rimmed eyes and a cup of untouched coffee in her hands. She stood trembling beneath the overhang as snow dusted her hair and coat. He saw the weight of silent shock in her posture and realized she did not yet fully believe the miracle that had begun to unfold. Robert turned the ignition quietly and drove away without announcing himself. Later that afternoon, Emily returned to her apartment with the note still clutched in her pocket. Her building stood hunched against the wind, a brick structure that had once been proud, but now showed its age in sagging window frames and thin walls that carried too much noise. The hallway smelled of boiled food and damp fabric. The landlord, a man named Carl Watkins, emerged from his office as she passed. Carl was in his late 40s with thinning dark hair combed desperately across a widening scalp and a sharp, narrow face made sharper by years of watching every dollar twice. He was not cruel by nature, but he had learned bitterness as a survival skill. He managed 6 properties for a holding company based out of state and hated the job almost as much as it hated him back. He offered Emily a stiff nod and avoided her eyes, already weighed down by half a dozen overdue rent notices waiting on his desk. Emily did not notice the new envelope taped to her door when she entered her apartment. Inside, the space felt emptier without the steady breathing of her dog. Canvas leaned against walls scarred with paint from years of struggle. The silence felt wrong. That evening, Robert sat alone at his kitchen table and opened the small metal box where he kept the few relics he never threw away. Inside lay a folded Marine flag, a photograph of a young boy with his dark eyes before the war took him, and a yellowed letter dated decades earlier written in a hand that trembled with youth. He did not cry. He only closed the lid carefully and placed it back under the floorboard. His choice had weight, but loss was not new to him. 2 days passed. On the 3rd morning, Emily opened her door to find Carl Watkins standing in the hallway with a man she did not recognize. The stranger introduced himself as Thomas Riley, Regional Asset Supervisor. He was tall and heavy in build with large hands that folded precision into his coat sleeves and eyes that never quite softened. His gray beard was trimmed with professional care, and his manner carried polite distance sharpened by practiced authority. He informed Emily with unsettling formality that a violation had been recorded. A large breed dog, a safety liability, a review clause activated by corporate instruction. She had 7 days to remove the animal or vacate the unit. Carl stood beside him with hands clasped nervously behind his back. His eyes flickered with quiet apology he could not afford to speak. Emily tried to explain. The dog was injured, recovering, temporary. Thomas Riley's voice remained smooth and unmoved. Policies required compliance. No personal exceptions. Emily closed the door gently after they left and slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold floor, the paper trembling in her hands. The world that had begun to open again after the night at the clinic now narrowed into another corridor of helplessness. That same afternoon, Robert returned to the clinic without turning off his engine this time. Dr. Klein met him with mild surprise and quiet recognition in her eyes. She told him the dog was stable, but the road ahead would be long. Recovery would require time, care, and expensive rehabilitation equipment. Robert nodded once. There was no complaint in him. When he stepped back into the street, the wind cut sharply through his collar, and something deeper stirred beneath his calm. He did not yet know about the eviction notice, but the war had taught him to sense when the ground was shifting beneath unseen feet. He drove back toward the city with that old, familiar tightening in his chest. Somewhere between the clinic and the frozen lake road, he understood that the help he had given had only delayed the greater threat, and he knew without speaking it aloud that the true battle had not yet begun. Emily did not sleep the night after the notice was delivered. The paper lay folded on the small kitchen table beside an untouched cup of cold tea, as if the words themselves might change if she did not look at them again. The apartment felt smaller than ever, the walls too close, the ceiling too low. Every familiar object now carried the quiet threat of disappearance. Her canvases leaned in rows against the walls, painted fragments of skies and lakes and imagined warmth, all waiting for a future she could suddenly no longer see. She sat on the edge of the couch in an oversized sweater, her chestnut hair loose and tangled, pale face drawn with exhaustion. Outside, snow slid slowly from the roof in soft, dull thuds that sounded like time slipping away, one careful second at a time. The following morning, she returned to the clinic early, walking through streets that felt less forgiving than before. Luna lay sedated in recovery, her bandaged leg suspended in careful alignment by metal supports and soft harnesses. The sight broke Emily's heart and healed it at the same time. Luna's young chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, her glossy coat dulled by medication, but her warmth still there beneath Emily's trembling fingertips. Dr. Margaret Klein reassured her that the worst danger had passed, but warned of months of rehabilitation ahead. Emily nodded, forcing herself to listen through the quiet roar of panic in her ears. When she left, she pressed her forehead briefly to the cold glass of the recovery room window, as if memorizing every breath her dog took. Robert returned to the clinic later that afternoon. He moved carefully through the snow as though the ground itself were watching him. Dr. Klein met him near the desk, her eyes soft with respect. She told him the dog was stable, that recovery would be slow and expensive, and that the young woman who owned her was trying very hard to stay strong. Robert thanked her with a brief nod and left without asking questions. Only as he reached the parking lot did the nurse call after him. She hesitated before speaking, glancing down the hallway as if afraid the walls might be listening. She told him about the eviction notice, about the 7 days, about the fear that had returned to Emily's face almost as sharply as it had left. Robert sat in his truck afterward, with the engine off and the cold seeping through the floorboards. His jaw tightened, but his hands remained steady on the wheel. Anger was not the feeling that took hold. It was recognition. He had seen this shape before, the way pressure moved without sound, the way power crushed quietly until resistance failed for lack of oxygen. He drove not home but across town, to a narrow brick building tucked between a pawn shop and a closed diner. Inside waited Daniel Harper, a retired municipal attorney who had once been known for defending tenants that no one else believed were worth the fight. Daniel was in his early 70s, tall but stooped, with thinning white hair combed carefully back and a neatly trimmed silver mustache that attempted to preserve dignity where time had already claimed ground. His skin carried the pale translucence of age and long winters spent beneath fluorescent lights, but his dark eyes still cut sharply through uncertainty. A stroke 5 years earlier had slowed his walk, but not his mind. Robert and Daniel had known each other decades earlier through a veterans' legal aid program. They were not friends in the traditional sense, but they shared something quieter and more durable than that. When Robert told the story, he did not dramatize it. He spoke simply about the girl, the dog, the car, and the eviction notice that followed. Daniel listened with hands folded atop his cane, his expression tightening as the pattern revealed itself. He asked few questions, but each one landed exactly where it needed to. Who owned the building? Who served the notice? How long since the accident? Whether police had made a formal report. Robert answered with calm accuracy. He had learned long ago that details saved lives. Daniel did not promise miracles. He warned that corporate holdings operated behind layers of distance designed to exhaust the weak long before a judge ever saw the case. But he also said that a 7-day notice meant someone wanted speed, not justice. And speed always left a footprint. He agreed to look into the ownership of the building and the circumstances of the violation. Robert did not speak of money. Daniel did not ask. For men like them, some debts lived outside currency. Across the frozen city, pressure was tightening on the other side as well. Jason Whitmore sat in his father's glass-walled office overlooking the lake. His long legs stretched out carelessly before him, as though nothing could truly reach him here. He wore a designer jacket over an expensive sweater and tapped nervously at his phone despite the casual mask he attempted to maintain. Jason was handsome in the way youth and money often sculpt it. Sharp jaw, flawless skin, restless light eyes that darted too often toward invisible threats. His confidence was not born of courage, but inheritance, and now small cracks were beginning to show. Pierce Whitmore stood behind the desk without sitting. In his late 50s, he was tall and disciplined in posture, his dark gray hair perfectly trimmed at the temples, his face carved into an expression of permanent authority by a lifetime of control. His voice was calm when he spoke, but it was the calm of storms seen from a distance. He did not yell. He did not need to. He asked Jason whether the rumors circulating in the neighborhood were true. Jason laughed too quickly and brushed it off as exaggeration. Pierce did not laugh at all. He informed his son that someone had filed a police inquiry about a hit-and-run matching the description of Jason's vehicle. Nothing formal yet. Just a whisper in the system. But whispers had a way of growing teeth. Jason's fear surfaced then, briefly, beneath the bravado. He insisted the accident had been nothing. A stray dog. A stupid girl. Ice on the road. Pierce studied him for a long, measured second before turning away toward the window. He told his son that nothing destroyed empires faster than public sympathy falling toward the wrong side. He said that disasters were manageable. Scandals were not. Jason swallowed and nodded. By evening, Emily received a call from Carl Watkins, the building manager. His voice was strained and apologetic in a way that carried no comfort. He told her the holding company was firm. No extensions. No exceptions. He admitted that the directive had not come from local management and that appeals would be limited. When she asked if there was any legal option, Carl hesitated. He had seen enough tenants disappear to know what questions led nowhere. Still, quietly, he suggested she seek independent legal advice. Emily thanked him and sat in the darkened apartment long after the call ended. Robert returned home to find Buddy lying alert at the door. He sat at the table and remained there for a long time without moving. The stove ticked softly as heat struggled through metal. Finally he rose, retrieved the folded Marine flag from beneath the floorboard, and unfolded it with steady hands. The triangular points were still sharp from decades of careful preservation. He did not display it. He only observed it for a moment before folding it again. Some symbols carried power whether anyone else saw them or not. That night, The rumor of a surveillance video began to ripple quietly through the neighborhoods near the lake. No names, no faces, only whispers that a shop camera might have caught something during the storm. The rumors reached Pierce Whitmore's office by morning. They reached the clinic by noon. They reached Emily by late afternoon in the form of a worried message from a neighbor who had overheard too much at a bus stop. Fear returned to her chest in cold waves. But something else arrived with it this time. Something steadier. A sense that invisible lines were shifting beneath the snow. Robert received a single phone call near dusk as the sky turned iron gray. Daniel Harper told him only that the building ownership had complicated layers and that the timing of the eviction notice raised uncomfortable questions. He did not speak of threats. He spoke of preparation. By nightfall, two forces were moving in opposite silence. One side driven by fear of exposure, the other by the slow patience of men who understood that truth rarely struck like lightning, but wore stone into dust by pressure alone. And between them stood a young woman with a wounded dog and a future balanced on the thin edge of 7 days. The repair shop stood at the far edge of the lake road, where traffic thinned and the wind carried the sharp, metallic scent of frozen water and oil. Its windows were clouded with years of exhaust and winter grime, and the painted sign above the door had faded into a pale ghost of its former red. Inside worked Harold Bennett, a man nearly 70 with narrow shoulders, trembling hands, and a spine that bent slightly forward from decades spent beneath engines. His hair was thin and white, always hidden beneath the same oil-stained cap. Deep creases cut through his leathery face, shaped by cold air, cigarette smoke, and caution learned the hard way. Harold had lived his entire life in Duluth, had watched factories close, neighborhoods thin out, and men with power come and go without consequence. He trusted no one easily, especially not men who drove expensive cars with winter tires that cost more than his monthly rent. 3 nights after the accident, Harold sat alone in the back office of his shop, staring at the small security monitor mounted in the corner. The footage had replayed itself in his mind too many times already. He had not intended to point the camera toward the street. He had only installed it after a window was smashed during a drunken fight 2 winters earlier. But the lens had captured everything through drifting snow and distorted light. The car's slide, the sudden impact, the body of the dog flung across ice, the pause at the corner as the driver looked back, the cold delay before the car vanished. Harold had watched the moment again and again, each time feeling the same tightening in his chest. He had told himself it was none of his business. He had told himself he was too old to invite trouble. Yet the image of the young woman collapsing in the snow would not loosen its grip on him. On the 4th morning, Harold shut down the shop early. He locked the front door with hands that shook harder than usual and drove to the small brick police station near Lake Avenue. The officer who met him at the desk was a young man named Evan Brooks, no older than 26, with sandy blonde hair cropped short and a face still carrying too much openness for the job he had chosen. Evan listened quietly as Harold explained, his nervous fingers twisting the brim of his cap. When the video was transferred from the flash drive onto the station computer, the room grew silent. Evan's eyes widened as the truth unfolded frame by frame without mercy or exaggeration. He did not comment. He only nodded slowly and thanked Harold for coming forward. Harold left the station with his shoulders aching and his heartbeat strangely lighter than it had been in days. By that afternoon, the file had reached the traffic division. By evening, it had reached the city desk of the local paper. The next morning, the headline ran in sober black type without spectacle or accusation. Hit and run investigation reopened after new video evidence surfaces. No name yet. No photograph. Only the facts and the image of a frozen street that everyone in town recognized. Emily heard the news from a neighbor who knocked on her door with a newspaper folded beneath her arm. The neighbor was Mrs. Doyle, a widow in her late 60s with short, curled gray hair and hands that always smelled faintly of laundry soap. She lived 2 doors down and had once brought Emily soup during a fever. Mrs. Doyle's voice shook as she explained. Emily read every word in silence. The photograph of the street corner looked strangely distant on the page, as though it belonged to another lifetime. Yet with each line of text, the wall pressing in around her seemed to retreat by inches she had not known were missing. By mid-afternoon, a call came from Carl Watkins. His tone had changed, no longer nervous, now carefully apologetic. The notice of violation had been placed on hold pending further legal review. Corporate instruction had shifted. For the first time since the accident, Emily felt that the invisible hand squeezing her future had loosened its grip. Robert learned of the video not from the paper, but from Daniel Harper. The old attorney visited him that evening, stamping snow from his boots before stepping into the cabin's soft firelight. Daniel's breath came hard from the cold and from the effort of climbing the narrow porch steps. He carried the faint smell of prescription ointments and office dust. When he explained what had happened, Robert listened without interrupting. Only when Daniel finished did he allow himself a slow nod. The pressure had shifted exactly as Daniel had predicted. Speed now belonged to those who wished the truth buried rather than those who had kept it silent. That same night, Pierce Whitmore watched the same footage in his downtown office with a stillness that frightened even himself. Jason stood several feet away, pale and restless, his confidence unraveling at the edges. Pierce did not raise his voice. He simply stared at the frozen image on the screen as his son's mistake replayed for the 10th time. He understood now that this was not only a personal threat, but a structural one. Public sympathy had weight. Investigation had direction. Even wealth struggled when pulled into daylight. He told Jason that lawyers had been instructed and that the police would be cooperative, but cautious. Jason nodded, swallowing hard, his hands shaking despite his efforts to steady them. In the days that followed, the town did not explode into outrage, but it hummed with quiet conversation. At grocery stores, at bus stops, outside the clinic. The names were whispered: the girl with the dog, the rich boy, the shop video. The paper did not sensationalize, but it did not relent either. With each careful article, the space for denial narrowed. Emily returned to the clinic daily. Luna's sedation was lightened as healing progressed, and her dull eyes slowly regained reflection. One afternoon, as Emily stood speaking softly to her, through the bars of the recovery pen, she heard footsteps behind her. Robert stood at the far end of the room near the door, his coat dusted with snow, Buddy sitting patiently at his side. There was no drama in the moment, only recognition. Emily approached slowly, emotion rising in her throat like a tide tested too often. She thanked him without knowing whether words were enough. Robert answered only that the dog seemed stronger. They stood together for a while in silence, united by the breathing of two animals who did not understand the human storm that had formed around them. Later that week, Emily drove beyond the city for the first time since the accident. The road to Robert's cabin wound between thin trees silvered by ice. She arrived at dusk with the sky bleeding pale color into snow and lake. Robert opened the door slowly. The fire burned low in the stove. Buddy rose immediately, alert but calm. Emily did not speak for several moments. The weight of unanswered gratitude pressed heavily against her ribs. She told him about the video, about the police, about the lifted eviction notice, about how she had begun to sleep again in fragments rather than terror. Robert listened with his arms folded loosely across his chest. When she finished, he spoke at last, his voice low and steady. He said that long ago he had learned a man could not save everyone, but he could still choose who he did not abandon. That evening, for the first time, Luna was brought to the cabin. Her leg was still locked in a careful brace. Her body thinner now, but her spirit unchanged. Buddy approached slowly, head lowered, tail sweeping the floor in slow arcs. There was no aggression, only understanding. The two dogs lay near the fire, one large and steady, the other fragile but alive, sharing warmth neither fully comprehended. Emily watched with hands pressed to her lips. Robert sat near the stove without moving. Outside, snow fell with quiet persistence. No celebration rose from the moment. No victory was declared. Only the knowledge that something dangerous had been forced back into shadow, and that for now, it had retreated. Winter did not release its grip on Duluth all at once. It loosened slowly, like an old man reluctant to let go of a familiar burden. Ice retreated from the edges of the lake in thin, jagged lines. Snow grew soft and gray instead of blinding white. The days lengthened by minutes at a time, and those minutes began to matter. The case against Jason Whitmore moved quietly through the county system. There were no cameras outside the courthouse, no shouting crowds, no dramatic arrests, just paperwork, testimony, and the slow pressure of evidence that could no longer be ignored. His license was suspended indefinitely. Insurance covered part of the medical cost. Personal liability followed after. The words sounded small on paper, but they carried weight. For the first time in his life, money had failed to erase consequence. There was no prison sentence, no public spectacle, no collapse of an empire, only accountability. For Robert, that was enough. He had not been seeking vengeance. He had only wanted truth to leave a mark. Emily returned to her routines out of necessity rather than confidence. The quiet terror that had once followed her doorways receded little by little, replaced by caution that no longer crippled her movement. Each morning she checked on Luna before she made coffee. The dog's coat had lost its winter dullness. The shaved patch along her hind leg marked where the surgeons had worked, and the scar ran pale and clean like a thin river through fur that would never grow quite the same again. Luna was smaller now, leaner from weeks of recovery, but the light had returned to her brown eyes. She learned to trust the leg again slowly, placing weight with care, pulling back when fear still whispered in muscle and bone. On good afternoons, when the wind off the lake gentled and the sky thinned into brittle blue, Emily carried her sketch pad to the small park near the shoreline. The benches were old and worn smooth by generations. Children returned to them cautiously as winter released its hold. Emily chose the same bench each time, not for habit, but because it faced the water. She painted less violently now. The fierce, frantic strokes that once dominated her canvases softened into lines that breathed. Recovery had changed her, not into someone stronger in the way movies celebrated, but into someone quieter, more deliberate. Robert began appearing there without announcement. Sometimes he arrived first, sometimes after. He never called ahead. He simply walked from the edge of the path with his hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat. Buddy always came with him, moving slower now than he once had, his muzzle touched with white that had not existed a year earlier. The German shepherd's body was thick and steady, his movements deliberate, his eyes still sharp but no longer restless. He lay at Robert's feet without command, content to feel the earth through his ribs and the cold sunlight through his fur. They did not speak much. It was not avoidance. It was understanding. When words came, they rose from necessity rather than politeness. Emily might say that Luna had walked farther that morning. Robert might answer that Buddy no longer chased sticks, but still watched geese with disciplined interest. The lake carried the rest. Spring did not arrive in triumph. It seeped into the city in hesitant gestures. Meltwater traced lines along the sidewalks. Dirt returned to the world, dark and honest. Trees budded unevenly, as if unsure whether they could trust warmth again. With it came new practical questions. Emily's landlord never apologized. He simply stopped pressing. The legal weight that had hung threateningly over her door dissolved into quiet compliance. Sometimes survival offered no closure, only relief. Robert returned to his cabin routines. The mornings began with splitting wood even when less was needed. The stove burned lower now. The nights shortened. He slept less and dreamed more. Not of war as often as before, but of roads, of running footsteps on frozen pavement, of a dog's breathing repeating in his chest long after waking. He did not speak of these things, but his hands lingered longer on Buddy's head in the evenings, and his gaze softened in ways that had once felt foreign. One afternoon in early April, Emily drove out to the cabin without warning. The road was muddy with thaw. Tire tracks cut deep grooves through earth that had not seen daylight in months. She brought no announcement with her, only a small bag of oranges and a folded blanket. Luna moved with effort beside her, the brace gone now, replaced by careful muscle and practice. Robert met them at the door with surprise written plainly on his face. He stepped aside without question. Inside, the fire burned gently. The cabin smelled of pine resin and old wood. Emily laid the blanket near the stove. Buddy joined Luna with a cautious snort and a flick of his ears. The two dogs lay together without ceremony, not touching but close enough to share warmth. Emily stood near the window for a moment before speaking. Then she said that the court date had passed, that Jason had accepted responsibility through his attorney, that there would be no more appeals, no more letters, no more quiet threats behind signatures. Robert nodded once. The matter closed in his mind. They shared stew without comment. The silence was not heavy. It was filled with the small, living sounds of recovery. The fire shifting, a dog's breath, wind sliding along timber. As the weeks passed, Robert found himself walking less alone. Sometimes Emily joined him on the trail through the thinning trees. Luna moved cautiously, but with growing confidence. Buddy walked ahead only when permitted. Robert showed Emily where the deer crossed the ridge, where ice broke earliest along the creek, where fox tracks lingered even when the sun climbed high. Emily sketched these things later, not for galleries, not for money, only to remember. The city did not celebrate Robert. No article bore his name. His face never appeared beneath headlines. He was not invited to speak. He was not thanked publicly. He returned to the role he knew best. Invisible. Working. Protecting without claim. Some men were shaped for applause. Others were shaped for quiet. For Emily, the transformation was quieter, but just as complete. She did not become wealthy. She did not gain sudden fame. Her life did not pivot into spectacle. But she began to wake without dread. She began to paint without rage. She built a life that was narrower than the one she had dreamed, but steadier underfoot. And Robert, for all his years and all his scars, discovered that some battles waited until the last chapters of a life to arrive. Not with gunfire, not with orders, but with snow and blood, and a frightened girl standing in the road. Spring came fully at last. Green returned to Duluth with hesitant brilliance. The lake cracked open along its long white spine. The park filled with sound again. On a warm afternoon, unlike any they had known that year, Robert and Emily sat on the same familiar bench by the water. Buddy rested with his chin on Robert's boot. Luna stood alert between them, her legs strong enough now to chase small things that did not matter. The sun lay gently on their faces. They did not speak of the winter. They did not speak of what might come. They simply existed in the space they had earned. And that was enough. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive with thunder or flashing light. Sometimes, a miracle comes quietly through a tired old man who chooses to stop, through hands that still know how to protect, through a heart that refuses to walk away. And in those quiet moments, God is working, silently, patiently, just as He always has. In everyday life, you may not face a snowy road or a wounded soul like Emily and Luna, but you may be carrying grief, illness, loneliness, or worries that no one else can see. Let this story remind you that God's help often arrives through people, through unexpected kindness, and through timing that only heaven can design. If you are still here today, still breathing, still listening, you are already living inside a miracle. And perhaps, without even realizing it, you may one day become the miracle in someone else's life. If this story touched your heart, please share it so its light can reach others. Please leave a comment with Amen as a quiet prayer of faith and gratitude. And if you have not yet subscribed, we invite you to subscribe to our channel so we can continue walking together through stories of hope, healing, and quiet strength. May God bless you and your family, protect your steps each day, calm your heart in difficult seasons, and place gentle miracles along your path, just as He did for Robert, Emily, and Luna.